Finley to throw. Over the middle, intercepted. Wolford again. Wolford the other way at the 30, the 40. Wolford to midfield. Miles Wolford with the pick. The Heels on the doorstep of an enormous victory. Williams is the running back next to Howe. Play action. Howe will now lob it down the near side. Newsome with a man all over him. Pins the ball against the back of the defender and brings it in. Heels can get a first down at the 3. Howe, pump fake to the right. Now he's going to run to the left. Howe at the 5. Takes the shot. Pinballing off the chains for the touchdown. Sam Howe showing the toughness for 6. Cardinals down 4, 35-31. May has the shotgun snap. Pressure coming. Rolls to the right. Throws to the end zone. Touchdown! Touchdown, Antoine Green! 16 seconds to go. No flag. Snapping it off the 8-yard line. May pulls it, tries to roll it apart. Now he's going to throw it and score! Throws it to Payson in the end zone for the touchdown. They are going to play for left-handed. Was rolling out on the run and threw it left-handed. Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio, he's going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
What's going on, guys? Welcome into another edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. It's your host, Anthony Pagnotta, here with you guys as always. And tonight we turn our attention to the defensive side of the ball, back to our position previews after we, of course, recapped ACC kickoff for you in the last edition of the podcast. Now it's back to the task at hand, which is getting you ready for this upcoming season on the field. And tonight, with the defense, we will take a look at the defensive line, the unit that honestly you probably feel best about, but there are still some questions that have to be asked of this group. And so we'll go through all of that here tonight on this edition of the podcast. Josh Marlowe, of course, alongside of me here. And, for me, I laid it out right there. I think it's the position that I probably feel the best about on the defensive side of the football. I mean, is that the case for you, or do you look at another position group on the defensive side of the ball and maybe feel a little bit better about them heading into the season?
No, I think it's safe to say going into the year, you feel the best about the defensive line. I'm intrigued by what the linebacker position can and will be. You brought over a veteran transfer from Syracuse to that spot. You brought up one from the FCS level. If those two guys hit, then that could maybe be maybe the strength of your front seven, depending on what happens up front for Carolina. Because you know what you have in Melkart Abou Jaoude. You've got some impact transfers that maybe you're hoping are going to be a bigger part of what Carolina can do up front. You got some guys back from last year that maybe second year in the system, a full offseason in the Belichick conditioning program, with the program having a lot more stuff just established. Maybe those guys are ready to take a step forward. The front seven at times last year was the strength of Carolina's defense, which I think, kind of played up to par after a disastrous first handful of games. But we saw the issues that really got exposed in those final 3 losses. They kind of got worn down. They were able to get run on. They got pushed around. And there wasn't a consistent pass rush outside of Abou Jaoude. So I think the goals this offseason were to get stronger, to get deeper, and to find another pass rusher opposite Melkart that could really elevate this defense to what we want and what you expect for that side of the ball, being, coached by Belichick's son, but knowing that Belichick himself has a lot of influence on what the team does on that side of the ball.
Yeah, you mentioned it. I think, one of the areas that you're going to look for this group to sort of take a step in is what they do on the interior of the offensive line, and even, or of the defensive line. And even when you kick it out to the edge rushers, it's just about being more consistent. And I think that's what you're looking for, is that you had some explosive moments, especially in the middle of the season from the edge rushers. That's really where Melkart started to have the success that he saw. That's where you saw even more success from a guy like Tyler Thompson during a short period of time than you saw at any other point during last year. Now it's about being able to start fast and being able to finish the season fast as well. Yes, you want to have that middle portion that you had a year ago, but, those areas where Carolina's got to get off to a good start to begin this season. We've talked about how important that season opener is. And then closing the season when you've got rivalry games late in the year against Duke and NC State, you're going to need to be able to close the year a lot stronger than you did a year ago. So it's going to be really intriguing to see what this group looks like this year. I think even with some of the questions that you have about this group, you really do feel like there's a lot of expectations for the guys in this room. There's a lot of hope with these guys where, linebacker, I think that's probably the other position that you look at. I have legitimate questions in the defensive backfield that I think are concerning. So, I think it's really for this group. It's about, a couple of things breaking right. If you get, Donovan Hoylett to hit or Jalen Harvey to hit, one of the two, then I think that's what you're hoping is going to allow you to set up for success this season. And then, in the interior of the defensive line, I think one of the key things there is, can you find the depth that you had there a year ago, or that you thought or that you did have, for the most part until it wore down late in the season? Do you have similar depth this year, or are you going to have to use Leroy Jackson and Isaiah Johnson as much as just about any defensive lineman that you've had to use since you had Jason Strobridge and Aaron Crawford? I think that's what people are kind of wondering about at this point is do you have enough in that room depth-wise to be able to ultimately hold up? But it really all starts with one guy and one guy only, and that would be Melkart Abou Jaoude. He was just fantastic at points last year. And you look, you got a guy that is really just a leader by example for Carolina. I think part of what it was, and the reason why you didn't see him that consistent, some people may wonder, well, why wasn't he that consistent a year ago? The guy was making the jump from the FCS level at Delaware. This was, the first big opportunity for him. And I think he was also learning a defense sort of on the fly, because I don't know if Carolina knew they were going to need him necessarily as much as they needed him last year. This time last year, we didn't even think Melkart was going to be a starter for Carolina. We thought that Bryce Yates was going to be the big get for Carolina out of the transfer portal. He ends up getting hurt. We don't see that much of him, and his career actually ends. He ends up medically retiring. And so that really opened the door for Melkart to step through. And you look at what he did a year ago, second team All-ACC member, most returning sacks of anyone in the conference, with both Ruben Bain and Akeem Mesidor departing. He was actually second in the conference last year. So even if it was just Ruben Bain, he would still be atop that list. Tallied 47 total tackles, 12 tackles for loss, 10.5 sacks, and 42 quarterback pressures. I think on the surface, you absolutely love everything that you see from those numbers from Melkart. You're hoping that he can sort of recreate that again this year. But I'm looking for just a little bit more consistency out of him, because 8.5 of those tackles for loss and 8 sacks came in a 3-game stretch in the middle of the year.
I talked about this when we did some ACC kickoff reaction. You want that production to be replicated. You just want it to be a little bit more spread out across a 12-game regular season. If he wants to stack the big games and have multiple sack performances, be my guest, but you would like to see that distribution of production just a little bit more distributed, where you look at it, a lot of the sack production, as you mentioned, a lot of the TFL production came in 3 games. Now, granted, you'd rather there be 3 games as opposed to none, but I think for him individually, that's something he's got to prove, I think, as he's trying to solidify himself as an NFL draft prospect, as an NFL player. The NFL is going to want him to be a lot more productive. They're going to want to see him not have the games where it feels like he disappears. And here's going to be the challenge that he's going to have to overcome this year. He's going to get the majority of the double teams, and teams are going to run away from him and try to figure out what does Carolina have opposite him, which is why if they can find someone that can step up, help set that edge, find someone that can help get after the quarterback, then I think that step forward comes a lot more easier because he's got the right kind of attitude. He's got the right kind of demeanor. He talked so much on Friday at ACC kickoff about how he's stronger, how he's a lot more explosive, how his body is ready for the rigors of the 12-game, schedule that Carolina plays against the type of opponents they're going to play. The TCUs, the Clemsons, the Miamis, the Notre Dames of the world. So it's fair to have expectations for him because, one, I think he's talented enough to have them. And two, I think he's not resting on his laurels from last year. So all eyes are going to be on him from game 1 all the way through game 12. And if he becomes a much more consistent player, that only spells good thing for the entire Carolina defense, but his other fellow defensive linemen as well.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that you did bring up is that he's not going to catch anybody off guard this year. I think last year towards the middle of the season, yeah, you played some teams that were struggling, but I also think that he kind of popped up out of nowhere and teams were like, what do we really do with him? You also had guys on the interior of the defensive line that were rotating in and out that allowed for the interior guys to be occupied. And Tyler Thompson, for the most part, especially in the middle portion of the season, was a guy that was really distracting from teams being able to double Melkart. This year, out of the gate, yeah, you're going to have a lot of attention on him. He's going to be the guy that everybody's going to be focused on taking away, and they're basically going to be daring somebody else to beat them. At the same time, I do think that Melkart has had another offseason to get stronger. As you mentioned, he's had another offseason in this playbook. They're going to get creative with how they use him. And so I really do think that this is a guy that is going to be able to take that next step for Carolina this season. I think he really found his footing in the middle of last year. Even though he wasn't great down the stretch, he wasn't completely invisible in the games that Carolina played down the stretch of the season. It wasn't that he completely disappeared and wasn't getting after the quarterback at all. I still think that, for the most part, you liked what you saw from him and you thought they were, that there was some things to gain. I mean, you look at the game against Duke, 5 pressures in that game, doesn't end up with a sack. And in the game against NC State, 4 pressures and does end up with a sack. So really, he finished the season strong. He had the one game against Wake Forest where he was a little quiet, but I think that he's going to really be able to build off of that going into the season. And he's on pace to be a guy that could be a first-team All-ACC type of player. And depending on just how gaudy the stat numbers get, if he's able to show that consistency of bringing the quarterback down, he could be a guy that threatens to be on an All-American team at the end of the season. The question is, outside of him at the edge rusher position, who emerges? Because there's 3 guys that I think have an opportunity to emerge here, more so 2 than 3. But I do think that there is a third name that is worth at least keeping in the running because he was on the roster last year, played 124 snaps. We'll get to him in a minute. But the guy that I think holds the starting position going into fall camp, just based off of them getting him out of the transfer portal, there not being a ton of buzz around either of the other 2 guys at this position. I would think, based off of what we saw from these guys last year, Donovan Hoylett, the transfer from Richmond, is going to be the guy that would be the starter if the season began tomorrow against TCU. He finished with 48 total tackles, 13 tackles for loss, 9 sacks, and had 44 quarterback hurries on his way to earning first-team All-Patriot honors a year ago. So a really outstanding player in terms of those numbers. But again, coming up from the FCS level, I think it'll be interesting to see how quickly he adjusts. But I really like those numbers that he brings there. And there's a reason why Carolina wanted him. They saw him last year. He only recorded 2 tackles in the game against Carolina, did not have a tackle for loss or a sack in that game. So maybe that concerns you a little bit. Maybe you say, look, against Carolina's offensive line, which wasn't great last year, you were hoping that he would do more. At the same time, I do think that those consistent numbers from last year, and he was a steady producer across the board for most of the season, those are numbers that you're hoping are going to translate to this level. I think it's going to be interesting to see. I think he's going to be someone that, no doubt in my mind, will start the season at least as part of the rotation. It will be interesting to see if he's the guy that ultimately ends up taking that starting role and holding it down opposite of Melkart Abou Jaoude as the season goes along.
Yeah, I think for him, the role, the snaps will be there in the opener. You'd imagine even the home opener, maybe even into game 3. I think the role is going to be dependent on how does he make that adjustment from FCS level to the Power 4 level. Can he handle the physicality, and can he be a difference maker? In his senior year, in his senior year last year at Richmond, was 6'4". He's listed at just 245 pounds. I wonder how much bigger he's going to get when he officially gets, now that he's at Carolina, how much more weight does he have to put on? But, you're talking about a guy that's got some experience, having played a handful of years of college football. You mentioned 48 tackles, 13 TFL. Those 13 tackles for loss, by the way, racked up to 79 yards. So you're talking about he was making plays pretty deep into the backfield, which means he, at the FCS level, had a very quick first step, able to get into the backfield. And so much about it is not just getting into the backfield, but finishing the play. Like, there is something to be said about, pressures, and pressures are a valuable stat, and being in position to make plays. There's something to be said for that. But how many times has it felt like we've had a dude that's had a quick first step or two, doesn't necessarily complete the play, and all of a sudden what should be a 4-yard loss turns into, a 2-3 yard gain, but that changes the entire play sequence. So I'm going to be really, really intrigued with him. You mentioned when he played against Carolina, there wasn't a big stat line. I wonder with this guy, when evaluating some of the film, and I know it was very early on in the year, if Belichick looked at him and thought he was better than some of the guys they had in their defensive line room a year ago anyway. And that was maybe a reason why, regardless of the minimal production against Carolina, hey, let's go out, let's go try to get this guy. So I think he's going to be given the opportunity. It's just, is he going to be able to make the most of it? And if he does, I think that goes a long way for this defense being a lot more outside of number 9 in terms of getting pressure on the quarterback and living in the opponent's backfield.
Yes, 9 of the 12 games that he played a year ago, he finished with at least 2 quarterback pressures, including the game against Carolina. He did have 3 quarterback pressures in that game, didn't have a lot of tackles, but was impactful at least at getting to the quarterback and putting pressure on him. There were, the one thing for him, very similar in terms of sack production to Melkart, is he had 2 3-sack games in there a year ago. That came against Howard and Georgetown. We'll see if he, ends up stretching those numbers out a little more consistently across those 12 games this year in the regular season. And you're hoping that the pressure numbers continue the way that they were at the previous level. If not, take a jump. I think that might be asking a little bit too much. But yeah, if he can replicate what he did last year here at Carolina, then I think Carolina would be very satisfied with what they got out of the transfer portal. He's one of those guys. I like both him, and we'll talk about Peyton Seelman when we talk about the linebackers. I like the prospects of both those guys. Coming up from the FCS level, they're going to be hungry to prove themselves. We saw it last year with Melkart. I think as long as he's someone that settles into this defensive scheme, which I don't have any reason to believe that he's not settling into this scheme, then I think he's going to be successful. And we heard his name. Andrew Jones brought him up when we were talking about some of the guys that were standing out from spring camp. And he said this was a guy that they could move inside as well, even at 245 pounds in certain NASCAR packages where you try to get 3 edge rushers on the field. This would be the guy that plays inside. To me, that tells you that you've got somebody that's handling the level of physicality. If that guy's able to play on the interior, then he's going to be able to handle the physicality of playing as an edge rusher. So I'll be really intrigued to follow him as he goes throughout fall camp, see if we get any more updates on him. The guy that'll be probably the biggest challenger to him for reps this season at that edge rusher spot opposite of Melkart would be Jalen Harvey, the transfer from Penn State. I mean, look, man, when it comes to Jalen Harvey, I think this is one of those guys that you really like on paper, former 4-star recruit. You're just hoping that everything sort of clicks for him here at Carolina the way that it didn't at Penn State. And look, the last time that you guys went and got a Penn State edge rusher, well, it was just last year. You went out and got Smith Vilbert. I have higher hopes for Jalen Harvey than I had for Smith Vilbert. Not that Smith Vilbert was terrible last season. I thought he was serviceable, but, not exactly what Carolina was needing. And it was the reason why eventually Tyler Thompson was the guy that emerged as that second edge rusher. With Jalen Harvey, I wonder, is he in a similar situation where, he comes to Carolina and has a chance to break out and just doesn't? Or is this going to be a guy that recognizes the talent and is finally able to sort of break onto the scene? I mean, last year, 8 total tackles, a tackle and a half for loss, 1 sack, and 9 total quarterback pressures. Now, you go back to the game that he started for Penn State last year. That was the bowl game against Clemson because of all the guys that ended up sitting out. Or actually, he didn't start that game. He played 15 snaps in that game, but that was where he had his only sack of the season. For the most part, played pretty well as a pass rusher. You're hoping that that's something that translates over into this season for him, and he can become one of the breakout stars for Carolina.
Yeah, and maybe what he's being asked to do here, maybe he's just a better natural fit than what he was being asked to do at Penn State. There also isn't the pressure here as there was for that Penn State team a year ago that a lot of people had handpicked to not only get to the national championship, play in the national championship game. We say this about certain position groups, with different programs across the country. You don't get to play defensive line at Penn State by accident. There's got to be something there for a program of that stature to want to bring you into the program and try to develop you. And a lot of times you expect 4-star defensive linemen, 4-star pass rushers when they go to Happy Valley to become NFL draft talent. Maybe not a first, second day pick, but you usually expect those guys to develop into NFL draft caliber players. You would imagine that he's got something to prove, that he's got to be a little hungry. Hopefully he's a little pissed off about the way last year went, collectively for Penn State, but also for him individually. And maybe that does play a role into the type of player that he ultimately becomes. I think, just on the surface, I think you like the size that he has at 6'2", over 260 pounds. So I think you like that aspect of his game. It's really just about trying to figure out at this level what kind of football player he is, what kind of football player he's capable of being, and maximizing that. And so this was, you go back to the well, as you mentioned, because you brought Smith Vilbert in from Penn State the previous year. I think it's okay to maybe expect more from Jalen Harvey than we did from Smith Vilbert. And I think, he's going to have the opportunity to really carve his name out and make it and be a factor on this Carolina defensive line. And it's going to start week 1 at TCU or against TCU in Dublin. And then from there, he'll have other chances as well to make a name for himself. And I'm going to be interested to see, what that first month of production looks like for him, and if this is a guy that plays himself into a bigger role, or if he falls himself out of favor, and we maybe have to just chalk this up as to a guy that was maybe somewhat overrated coming out of high school.
Yeah, I think we'll learn pretty quickly. I think we'll know right out of the gate whether or not you got somebody that you think can contribute for Carolina this year, or if you're going to have to roll with Hoylett. And I think that's the reason why you brought Hoylett in. Yes, you like the prospects of a Jalen Harvey, and you think this is one of those guys that you found and you can do something with that Penn State just wasn't able to do it with. And I mean, yeah, part of it is you're just banking on this being a guy that, hey, Penn State, maybe eventually Penn State does get something out of him. Penn State just had too many good edge rushers in front of him this past year to where they weren't able to necessarily get him on the field as much as they wanted to. There were some games that you would have liked to see him probably get a few more pressures in terms of the number of snaps that he ended up playing. But the thing that I would point to, and the reason why I think that he is a guy that could be set up for success, he reminds me a lot of Tyler Thompson, where coming into last year, we saw it in high school. We thought this was going to be a guy that was going to come in and make a pretty immediate impact for Carolina along the defensive line. And it took a little bit of time, but eventually he was able to put on the weight. He was able to find the system that fit him well. And last year, when he was in a role where all he had to do was rush the passer, that was really where he thrived. Tyler Thompson was a guy that we knew, hey, we're not going to put him in many rundown situations. And that's why it was perfect that you had a guy like Smith Vilbert that could slot in there. But now, yeah, I think Jalen Harvey could be used in a very similar role this year. I think Hoylett is a guy that is much better against the run. Now, the thing is are you going to get to a situation where Hoylett is also that good against the pass where you have no choice but to play him, and Jalen Harvey sort of gets buried a little bit on the depth chart, at least until next year? I think that's going to be interesting to monitor, but a couple of really interesting choices for Carolina that they can use at that edge rusher spot opposite of Melkart. And also maybe, at times we'll see Hoylett and Harvey on the field at the same time to give Melkart a little bit of a break, as opposed to last year where he was on the field pretty much exclusively throughout the entire second half of the season. The other edge rusher that I said, hey, you just have to throw him in there because you never know, is Joseph McCoy, another transfer from Penn State. That was a guy that also, just was never able to find the field as a young player at Penn State, ends up transferring out, now is in the system for a second year with Carolina. Last year in 124 snaps, he finished with 7 total tackles and 4 total quarterback pressures across 9 games. Look, guy that has the size. I think that's the one thing that really sticks out about him already. When you look at his frame, I mean, 6'5", I think, 261 pounds. I'm trying to pull up the roster here as we speak, but the computer not wanting to let me do that. So I mean, yeah, he's certainly a guy that has the frame that you want to be able to play that position. And so I think that's the one thing that Carolina is really staunch about. What this staff is really staunch about is these guys that are long, these guys that have the right weight. And yeah, 6'5", 261 pounds in his redshirt junior year. So he's been around for a while now. He's gotten used to the college game, a guy that didn't play a lot of football at the high school level because he came from the Dominican or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So this is definitely a guy that I think as the years go along, you would think is going to progress. He's had another year in the system. The staff has him where they want him height and weight-wise, and so now it's just a wait and see as to whether or not he ends up breaking out. But this could certainly be someone that helps to provide a little bit of depth and at least shows up on the 2 deep again this season.
Yeah, I wonder how much the second year in the system, a full offseason with just everything in place, benefits a guy like this that has the the frame to be a difference maker. You mentioned 6'5", 260 pounds. You like that. You love that. It feels like, we talked about it with the offensive line. It feels like they want to target big. They want to target big offensive line. We're talking about multiple dudes 6'6" and bigger. It feels like, if you can get some dudes 6'4", 6'5", they got some long arms that can get off of blocks and track down runners. Feels like maybe something that they want to put, in their defensive front. And he has that. It's really, I think, more about just trying to find a way to get onto the field. Did play in 9 games a year ago. Totaled 7 tackles, one tackle for loss, had 4 quarterback pressures across 120 snaps. It's really about just maximizing your time on the field. Because I think they want to be able to rotate guys, keep dudes fresh, not have the issue that they ran into last year, where it felt like that defensive front just got worn down. In those final 3 games, it felt like they just really had a hard time getting off of blocks. They got pushed around in the run game. It's hard to do that though if you're backups, and when you're talking about backups and your defensive line, those guys are important, man. Like, yeah, they may not be starters, but you need those guys to be able to play. I would say anywhere from 15 to 20 snaps on a given Saturday, depending on how many snaps you play. And at the collegiate level, games average about 75 to 80 offensive snaps. You got to think about it at the NFL level. That number drops significantly, where you're playing 60 to 65 snaps. So if he's a 15 to 20 snap guy, can you maximize your time on the field and there not be the drop off that there seemed to be at different times a year ago? So I think he has a lot of things that you have to like in terms of just the body that you want, the body and the size that you need. It's really just more about him kind of taking that step in the system where he should be very familiar with it, understand what his role is, and just trying to be the best football player he can be, and just seeing how that translates onto the field for this football team.
Yeah, you're just hoping he got a little bit stronger, I think, as well. That's one of the other things that I think really stood out about him, was that he was a guy that at times was really just battling out there on the edge, was trying to free himself up. If he adds a little bit of strength there, it should make it a little bit easier to shed some of those blockers or add a little bit of speed off the line of scrimmage, get a nice quick release. That could be something that could help him as well. So I'm intrigued. I think he's going to take another step this year. And you're right. If he could be a guy that just plays even 210 snaps in the season, where he averages about 15, anywhere from 15, 16 snaps a game, maybe even a little bit higher than that, then I think you're feeling pretty good about where he's at. And you're feeling pretty good about the depth that you have at that edge rusher position, which is ultimately what you're trying to build for this upcoming season. We move to the interior of the defensive line, and this is where you've got 2 guys back from last year, but you do lose 2 significant pieces of the rotation. For some people, probably the 2 best players they thought out of the rotation a year ago. DeAndre Robinson, the transfer from Florida, ends up moving on to Oregon. And then CJ Mims, the transfer from East Carolina, he's going to Texas A&M. Those guys had their moments, but you do still have Leroy Jackson and Isaiah Johnson back from last year. Leroy Jackson last year, I thought, was one of the breakout players for Carolina. 37 total tackles and 3 total quarterback pressures. But the thing is, didn't register a tackle for loss, didn't register a sack, and you're hoping that those are areas that he's going to be able to improve in this year. I think really comes back to him getting off the line a little bit quicker, being a little bit more physical in the middle, and really pushing guys back off that line of scrimmage to be able to make plays in the backfield. That's the one thing, is that, they lose some guys that were decent contributors in terms of tackle for loss in the middle of that defense. And that wasn't really an area that the middle of the defensive line really shined a year ago. It was more of the guys like Melkart who had a bunch of tackles for loss. Smith Vilbert, Tyler Thompson, Andrew Simpson, the middle linebacker. A lot of those guys were the ones doing the heavy lifting there. So Carolina's going to need some more, pushback from the interior of the defensive line. They're going to need guys that can end up dropping guys in the backfield for losses. But Leroy Jackson is a guy that I really like that Carolina was able to keep, and I think he's a pretty important piece for Carolina heading into this season.
Yeah, no doubt about it. With those two departures, as you mentioned, he needs to build off of a season that last year earned him freshman All-American honors from the Athletic. Despite, as you mentioned, not registering a TFL, not registering a sack, did have 2 quarterback hurries and a pass breakup. I think what you have to like is that, against Richmond, very productive game where he had 7 tackles in that game. He had 5 in the game, against Duke. 14 of his 37 tackles were solo. So, does have the ability to fight off of blocks and make tackles without there being another Carolina defender in the play. You just want to see maybe those plays take place behind the line of scrimmage, and you're getting some TFLs. You're getting a much more consistent push. I don't know if it's that. I wouldn't say that he got moved a lot. I would just say he didn't do a whole lot of moving the offensive linemen the other way, which I think is the next. That's the next step for him. There's something to be said about him being a stone wall and being an immovable object. But at some point, we're talking about getting help from Melkart. This is a guy that if he can provide some sort of interior pass rush, that changes the game for Carolina's defensive personnel and really what Stephen Belichick can do with these guys. So he's the face of this area of the defense now going into his sophomore season. And I'm really excited to see how far he's come, because you'd have to imagine the focus this offseason was getting stronger, maybe even a tad quicker to be able to make plays in the backfield. And hopefully we see that on display in the opener against TCU. And if that's the case, I think it changes maybe the narrative around this defense in the front seven and their ability, I feel like at sometimes last year, to get run on the way they did in some of their losses there down the stretch.
Yeah, and I mean, you go back and look at the season that he had, and the one thing that I do want to stress is that he still made some productive plays. Pro Football Focus has a stat that's called defensive stops, which is tackles that constitute a failure for the offense. He still had 16 of those. So it wasn't like he was a guy that was out there doing nothing. It wasn't like he was just taking up space. That was still tied for 7th most for Carolina last year. Now, the problem is that out of the 4 defensive tackles that we're talking about, that was 4th out of that group. And so you're hoping that he's going to be able to take another leap this year. If he could provide a little bit more pressure, I think that would be great. Even if he's just the pure run stopper for Carolina, I think you can live with that. You're hoping that other guys that are a part of this unit, some of the younger guys that are further down the depth chart, and even Isaiah Johnson, who I thought you saw in moments last year show that he was capable of being a pass rusher. You hope that those guys can really provide in that area, and he's a guy that can just focus on stopping the run. I think last year was really about figuring out for him whether or not he could play. And when they figured that out, it was, okay, let's just ride this throughout the rest of the season, see how good of a year you can put together, and then we'll work on you next year to make you into a player that can be, even more consistent and more productive for us in year 2. And so I think that's what you're going to see this year. I think he's going to be a guy that, especially if he has added reps, could be up near 50 total tackles this year. I'd like to see, can he get 4 or 5 tackles for loss, maybe even a little bit more than that. That might be asking a little bit too much, but in that 4 or 5 range, I think if you get in that area, you can give me maybe 10 quarterback pressure, something like that. Just show me that you can win off the line of scrimmage and be able to stop, these backs in the backfield, or even if you're stopping them, 1-2 yards from the line of scrimmage where it results in one of those defensive stops, I think you could live with that for Carolina. And then you go over to Isaiah Johnson. That's going to be the guy that's going to be next to him. The other guy that was a part of the rotation last year that returns. I really like some of the things that I saw from him last year. Again, this was another guy very similar to Leroy Jackson that hadn't really played a lot coming into last year at his previous stop at Arizona. Carolina picked him up in the transfer portal. We did not know what to expect. And he comes in and finishes with 40 total tackles, 2.5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, and 7 total quarterback pressures in 330 snaps. I thought he was incredibly important for Carolina at portions of the season, especially in the middle portion of the season. I thought that was where he really shined as well. So, this is a guy now that I think the coaching staff trusts. I mean, you look at him; he was a guy that Pro Football Focus absolutely loved everything that he did. He graded out incredibly well across the board. For just about every game, tailed off a little bit towards the end of the season. But as I mentioned, that middle portion of the season was really where he put together some strong performances against Syracuse, against Stanford. He looked really good in those moments, and he had 19 defensive stops a year ago. You're hoping that those numbers are going to go up for him, but another guy that I think Carolina feels pretty good about going into the season, and they feel that they can at least rely on both him and Leroy Jackson out of the gate this year when there's not a whole lot else to rely upon at this position group in particular.
Yeah, you mentioned, playing well in the middle of the season, played really well against Duke, recorded a sack, had 5 tackles, and that heartbreaking loss to Darian Mensah and the Blue Devils. If the floor is his production, you're not going to argue with that. It's just what's that uptick capable of being? What's the next step for him? Can you get that TFL number to like maybe that 6 to 8 range? Can you get those sacks to, even if it's just in that 4 to 5 range? Can you do something along those lines? In addition to what you're able to provide as a run stopper, I think that'd be a good sign for Carolina. That'd be a really good testament to him just continuing to grow and develop as a football player. Remember, as you mentioned, he showed up from Arizona, not knowing what to expect. He had 9 total tackles before he got to Carolina. Last year, he totaled 40, 20 solo, 20 assisted. So there was a massive step forward for him. And so seeing what he could do going into this year, kind of have your eyes a little bit more opened up to what he was able to do. You saw there in the certain stretch of the season just how productive and disruptive he can be, kind of like a bunch of other guys we talked about so far. Feels like consistency is a big thing for him, and just showing up in the stat sheet on a week in, week out basis. And if he does that, these 2 names they're not sexy. They're not gonna probably up for awards. But if these 2 guys take a step forward, it'll do a lot of things for this front 7 that has Melkart, but we're confident in these 2 linebackers. But if these 2 guys that we're talking about just do their job, it makes the job easier for those 2 linebackers. And that was something we talked about last year, was how many times did it feel like, Kamori House and Andrew Simpson just couldn't be the players we thought they were going to be because what the defensive line was incapable of doing. Now, I think Carolina's in a better spot with Kamori House no longer here from a culture standpoint, but I believed in the talent. I thought he was going to be a really good football player. If Leroy Jackson and Isaiah Johnson can be really good football players, it makes the job easier for those 2 linebackers. One that's coming over from a fellow ACC school, one making that transition up from the FCS level. But then that front 7 can be a lot more complete than it was a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, I liked what the interior of the defensive line did for the most part last year. I mean, again, you're talking about guys that were not major contributors at their previous school outside of DeAndre Robinson. And so for them to come in and really be handed 330 or more reps for each of these guys. I mean, CJ Mims, my mistake, certainly a guy that played a huge role for East Carolina, but that was a step up for him, and he ends up playing well. It was Mims, it was DeAndre Robinson. Those were the guys that mostly got after the quarterback last year, and even they weren't necessarily great in that area. That's the area that I wonder about the most with these two guys is, are you going to get more production out of them when it comes to getting after the quarterback? 10 total quarterback pressures between the two is not gonna work, man. I mean, especially when you had Isaiah Johnson play 154 pass rush reps, and you had Leroy Jackson play 184. Those numbers got to be higher, and so that's the area that I'm worried about with them. I'm not worried about them in the run game. I thought they did a really good job last year. The thing that concerns me is with the lack of knowledge of what's behind them. Are they going to get worn down as the season goes along, especially if they're having to play 500 or more snaps? These could be guys that wear out very easily. So hopefully that's something that Moses Cabrera has been working on with them in terms of getting them in the right type of shape that they need to be to play the amount of reps that they're going to have to play. And the other thing is you're going to have other guys emerge. One other stat that I wanted to throw out there before we talk about the other guys that could possibly show up in this room. Isaiah Johnson last year, 330 snaps, as I mentioned. He had 0 missed tackles a year ago, did not miss a single tackle, and Leroy Jackson missed just 2 all season long. That's a 5.1 miss percentage in terms of tackles. Those were 2 of the best marks on the entire team, especially for guys that played as many snaps. Isaiah Johnson, easily the guy with the most snaps that had a 0% percentage in that category. And then Leroy Jackson, that third on the team in terms of the miss percentage for guys that played at least 100 snaps. So those are guys that don't miss tackles. I think they're going to be fantastic this year. It's just about taking a step as a pass rushing group. Behind them is where you have all the question marks. Because you get to a guy in Tarvorius Brown, the transfer from Florida, 5 total tackles, 0 total quarterback pressures, and 53 snaps over 2 seasons at Florida. The reason Carolina likes him is this is a guy that came from the JUCO level, landed at Florida, that you got to be talented in order to do that. And he's 6'7", 296 pounds. So that's a frame that you just can't teach. That's certainly something that I think Carolina is attracted to. He looks like he's showing up in a lot of the 2 deeps that we're seeing right now. So that would tell me that he's a guy that's at least showing something in practice. But I'll be intrigued to see if he can break out. If it's one of the true freshmen, Viliami Moala, Trayshawn Ruffin, the 2 guys that we heard their names the most, really because of just the sheer size of those guys. Moala goes 6'2", 357 pounds. Trayshawn Ruffin, 6'3", 350 pounds. And, I mean, look, productive at their schools. Moala last year at Thompson High School down there in Alabama, 76 total tackles, 15 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, and 9 quarterback hurries for one of the better schools in that state. Trayshawn Ruffin in 4 years of production at North Duplin High School in Calypso, North Carolina. He had 164 total tackles, 22 tackles for loss, 11 sacks, and 3 quarterback hurries. So, again, I wonder with Moala and with Trayshawn Ruffin, do they do the things that, if they can end up showing some of the technical skills that they need to show? People were talking about how, size-wise they were there, but technically they just weren't there in the spring. If they can get there, are they going to be guys that can simply just clog up the middle for you? And you have to depend on your edge rushers to be able to get pressure. I think even if they really hold down that role, that would be huge for Carolina, or if you get a breakout from a guy like Tarvorius Brown.
regardless, when we talk about these three in a cluster, you're talking about two that are incoming freshmen and Brown, the Florida transfer. Just not a lot of known production at the college level. What I think is going to be very interesting with the freshmen is knowing that 27 is like Belichick's North Star, and that's what they're building towards. That's the year where they think that they'll be ready to really compete on both sides of the ball. How much playing time do these two guys get just to maybe accelerate their growth, accelerate their development? You do the recruiting stuff. You do a great job with that. I remember how big the Ruffin recruitment was, and just it felt like he was a really big part of this big recruiting class that Carolina brought in. Much to the dismay of Josh Graham from the national media, who was railing on what Carolina is doing from a roster build. And it's easy to see why. 6'3", 350 pounds, and as an in-state prospect, you want to keep a guy like him home. And then I love, God, I butcher that name. 6'2", 357 pounds. That's some beef. That's some big boys right there. And if you go back to when Belichick's defenses were, elite at different times, what do they have in the middle of it? You had Vince Wilfork, who was just a massive human being. And I'm not saying that's what these guys are going to be, but you saw how impactful that guy was able to be at the NFL level. If you can even replicate that at the collegiate level, what does that look like moving forward? So a lot of unknown, obviously, but I do think it's going to be interesting to see what those snap counts maybe look like when we get that stuff on Sundays or Mondays, because I would not be surprised. You don't see a lot of freshmen playing, on the trenches. Usually you wait till their sophomore years because their bodies need to get ready. But I do wonder what the two freshmen is. They're going to be maybe an accelerated schedule for them. Get these guys on the field, because I'd have to imagine they want to be a big part of what this defense looks like in 2027.
Yeah, I mean, there's just not the experience in front of them. I mean, with Brown coming in, there's just not a lot of track record to go off of. I mean, he really, as I said, 53 snaps over 2 years. I mean, that's not much at the power conference level to have you feeling confident in him going into the season that, hey, he's a guy that can play the type of reps that we saw Leroy Jackson or Isaiah Johnson play last year. But we were saying the same thing at this time last year about these guys. So maybe, Brown is a guy that's ahead of where he needs to be. But, I think it's going to be hard, especially if they start to show you the talent that they showed in high school and the production starts to show up when they get into fall camp. Those are guys that are around the ball making plays. It's going to be hard to keep 357 pounds and 350 pounds off the field because, yeah, as you mentioned, when you had guys like Vince Wilfork, the thing is that they were big. He was a big guy that could move well. That's what you're looking for out of this group is, can you have big guys that move well with their weight? And when you watch these guys on high school tape, they certainly look that way. Now, I think they put on a little bit more weight since they've gotten here. I don't know if that's by design or, if that's something that they're going to have to work on getting down. But regardless, these were names that were talked about back in the spring. So we'll have to see if they show up. I would count on guys like Moala and Ruffin to be guys that show up maybe a little bit later in the season. Might be Tarvorius Brown that gets the first opportunity. But if he fails and or struggles a little bit and some of these guys are showing out in practice, then maybe that's where Moala and Ruffin start to get onto the field and start to play big roles for Carolina. One other guy that's really intriguing in this room is Xavier Lewis, the undersized defensive tackle, 6 foot, 250 pounds, but he is an effective edge rusher. We saw him at different times last year, especially early in the season. He was getting after the quarterback, was, being shouted out by Pro Football Focus for how well he was playing. He had 8 total tackles last year, half a tackle for loss, half a sack, but he did have 15 total quarterback pressures, which is the most of anybody that returns at that defensive tackle spot. That is more, as I said, with Isaiah Johnson and Leroy Jackson. They had a combined 10 last year. Xavier Lewis in limited snaps a year ago ends up with 15. So I know he's small. It doesn't appear as if he's really put on any weight here this offseason, but I definitely think he's a name to keep an eye on here if he can still factor in as an edge rusher, because Carolina needs to be able to rush the passer out of that position, and maybe a guy that just specializes in that you can put in there on third downs will fit what Carolina needs going into this year.
Yeah, even though he might be undersized, 15 quarterback pressures, that's going to get you onto the field. And maybe it's, you mentioned those NASCAR packages. Maybe it's in a special package that they have built around him because of how small he is. But disruption is production. And so you cannot. You talked about leaving. You're talking about leaving that size, on the sidelines with the 2 freshmen. You can't leave quarterback pressures on the sideline either. It's not to get a sack is to pressure the quarterback. And so if you're going to give me 15 pressures in limited snap time, well then I got to find a way. Belichick has to find a way to get him on the field more often, and just see, can that number increase? And if he can you turn the pressures into sacks? And so fascinating, because you would not think at that size he would be able to get into the backfield and be able to cause havoc, but that was the exact opposite, as you mentioned there, with those 15 QB pressure. So I would imagine you maybe put on a little bit more weight this year, maybe beefed up a little bit, but at his size and his speed, that first step is the name of the game. We don't want him to get a little too heavy where it slows him down. Be interesting to see just how he is used, because I do think there is a role for him, despite him not being able to, the type of snaps you'd want him to be, and with his ability to get into the backfield and put pressure on the quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, you'd love to play him more snaps, but hey, if he's a specialist that really in those obvious passing downs, you just line up and you allow him to use that quick first step off the line of scrimmage, beat guys inside, and gets pressure on the quarterback, you're going to live with that. Now, the thing that you want to see this year is, can you finish some of those pressures and sacks? I think that would be very helpful for Carolina. But yeah, I mean, I like him. I'd like to see him play a little bit more for Carolina. I mean, he played 16 snaps in the game against Duke, the second to last game of the year, played 14 in the game against NC State. It's just, you've got to prove that you can at least do something in the run game. If he can hold up in the run game, then I think Carolina's got an opportunity. But I mean, you look at last year, he played 167 total snaps. 130 of those were pass rushing snaps. So they're using him very strategically. I think that's one thing. When we talked about Carolina defensively last year, we were just talking about taking strides. I don't think the thing that we realized about Stephen Belichick was that he was going to be able to use guys a lot more strategically than the previous coaching staffs did. And maybe that was one of the big issues for Carolina's previous defensive coordinators, was that you pretty much rolled with the same group no matter what. Last year, look at some of the guys that were on the field in certain situations. Xavier Lewis, a guy that was on the field rushing the passer. Greg Smith, who was a hybrid safety linebacker who was on the field in obvious passing downs. Those are the types of things that I think really work to Carolina's advantage. So I'll be interested to see if they use Xavier Lewis a lot this year, or if there's somebody else that maybe, at some point emerges from this, freshman group, from some of the redshirt freshmen in this room that maybe shows up and can handle themselves in the run game a little bit more, to where they take away some of those snaps. You look at the other guys to close out the interior defensive lineman. David Jackson, the third. He is a freshman, a true freshman from Our Lady of Good Counsel in Olney, Maryland. 131 total tackles, 23 tackles for loss, and 11 sacks in 3 years of production. Vodney Cleveland, another guy, the highest rated of all the defensive linemen, but the guy that we heard the least about when it came to spring practice. 106 total tackles, 8.5 tackles for loss, and 5.5 sacks in 3 seasons for Parker High School in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, I don't know if those stats are nearly as complete as they need to be, so there could have been more production there for him at the high school level. It just wasn't logged on Max Preps. You have Nico Maggio, redshirt freshman in that room, 2 total tackles and 25 defensive snaps and 5 special team snaps a year ago. And Trey Giddens, 2 total tackles in 8 defensive snaps and 1 special team snap a year ago. Like I said, I favor the true freshman. I said this a while back about this group, but I favor the true freshman in this room to be able to emerge a little bit earlier than some of the redshirt freshmen. You never know, but those, guys like Maggio, Giddens, they were really late adds, guys that I think were really added just to provide some deeper depth on the roster last year. I think they'll be in similar roles this year. Edge rushers, in terms of deeper depth for that room, Daniel Anderson, a guy that's in his 3rd season with Carolina, 3 total tackles in 21 defensive snaps. But more significantly, and the reason why I think he has a chance to actually play this year, if McCoy struggles, that could be a guy that he ends up overtaking at some point on the depth chart, something like that. Played 210 special team snaps a year ago. If you're playing that many special team snaps, you're a guy that the staff at least trusts in some form or fashion. So definitely a guy that I think another year in the system, maybe he ends up taking some strides this year and can maybe jump into that 2 deep before the season is over. You've got a couple of really talented true freshmen as well. Xavier Griffin Haynes, in-state player in this past recruiting class. 63 total tackles, 15 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks, 18 quarterback hurries. Problem is that came in 3 years at Rollsville High School out there in Rollsville, North Carolina. So he's going to have to be a lot more productive at this level if he's going to be someone that plays this year. Ashton Blatt, I think that's the guy that I look at and think he has a better chance to play as a true freshman just because of the sheer production that he showed in his final year. 57 total tackles, 22.5 tackles for loss, 15.5 sacks at Central Catholic High School in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And then another guy, this one's going to be interesting to see where he ends up. Jimmy Frisco Alu Sulafu. He's a guy that played that played a little bit of defensive end, a little bit of defensive tackle. You look at the size, and he really is a tweener at his size right now. Now we see, a guy like Xavier Lewis, who's 250 pounds, playing at defensive tackle. So I think he could certainly play there. But you look at the frame for him, and it's kind of right in between what you're looking for from an edge rusher and from a defensive tackle in this system. He's 6'3", 271 pounds. So I could see him showing up at either one of those positions. You never know. I really liked him. He was one of the more underrated players. I thought coming out of this high school class, a guy that we should have been talking more about. So yeah, keep an eye on Ashton Blatt and Jimmy Frisco Alu Suliafu this upcoming season. Xavier Griffin Haynes, just, the tools are there. I think it's about showing up and the production actually being there for him to get on the field. And then rounding out the room, Emmanuel Mwewu is the guy that closes it out. He did not play a single snap last year as a freshman, but he's hoping that he can sort of carve out some sort of role for Carolina this year. He was another guy that was a late add out of Canada to that recruiting class last year. So, 6'4", 250 pounds. Again, another guy that you're just trying to figure out where exactly he fits and what kind of role that he can end up playing. I mean, any of those guys, you feeling passionate about any of those guys potentially breaking out this year? Is there one that sticks out to you that maybe you feel like makes a difference this year?
I don't know about breaking out. I think the thing is kind of picking back off what we talked about with Ruffin and Mwala. It's just, these guys could be the future of the room. Carolina has brought in a lot of freshmen. They've got some redshirt freshmen as well. They're wanting to build these trenches up. How much can you get these guys onto the field, and how much can you grow and develop these guys on Saturdays? If not, we know how important Sunday Night Football was for so many different guys a year ago. Is that going to be the same case for a program that right now is preaching patience, and their main focus is all about internal development? You just got to hope and pray that development, that investment that you're spending in with these guys leads to them still being productive players for you on down the road in Carolina blue uniforms. Not you develop them and they go somewhere else. So I think, this is where when you see how many names that we just ran through and how many of these are freshmen or redshirt freshmen, that's where you can start to see the vision for Lombardi and Belichick start to take shape, start to take form. It's now just about, what do these guys look like, and how many of these guys are we're going to be talking about this time next year. I think that's the real big question mark, is how many of these guys that feel like important pieces this year, but more importantly, in the next couple of years, are we getting to talk about this time next year? And if we are, I think that would sell you two things. That one, Carolina probably won enough for these guys to stick around, and two, they feel they're getting the development that they want to get from a Hall of Fame head coach at the NFL level, where maybe if we don't win, they're still trusting in what he's preaching and the process that he is putting all these guys through to make them the best football players possible. I wish there were a lot more cupcakes on the schedule to where we could get these guys onto the field and we could point out, hey, there should be, 3 or 4 games we should get to see you in action. There's only one of those games this year, and then hopefully that's the case, and we get to see some of these guys suit up and we can get a little firm semi-evaluation of them. But I'm not going to expect any of these guys to break out in any sense in 2026.
Yeah. I break out, I think, for these guys would mean get into the 2 deep and be a guy that, maybe gets an occasional rep here or there. You never know. Again, we saw last year this group is not afraid to play freshmen if they succeed. So if these guys stand out, hey, they're going to throw you out there on the field at certain times and give you an opportunity. It's just, as you said, how many opportunities like that are you going to get? Garbage time against some of these bad teams. You got one that we think is going to be that type of game. Can't even count that at this point because you just never know. East Tennessee State. We're hoping that's one of those games where you can see these guys. And then, we're hoping we don't have to see you guys the rest of the season. Because if we do see some of these guys that are really deep on the depth chart, then that means that Carolina is getting blown out in games more than likely, as opposed to the other way around. So we don't want to see that again this year. We saw that a little too often, especially early on last year with this group. But all these guys you can find on the website, heeltupblog.com. We got the article that'll be going up here right after we're done here on this edition of the podcast. I've been putting them out in the morning, but I didn't think the articles were doing nearly as well. So I think I'm going to put them out at night for you guys, give you something to read after the podcast is done. And the reason to read it, guys, is yes, you get a little bit more in-depth analysis on some of these guys, but you also get the projected depth chart, at least from my perspective, going into fall camp and what I think it'll be when the team reaches the season opener against TCU. So make sure that you guys go over to the website, heeltupblog.com, shortly after this. Actually, the article's up there right now. If you guys want to read it, I just haven't shared it yet. So make sure you guys go and give that a check. That would be, we would greatly appreciate that. As for the other stuff that you'll have on the website, again, we've got the rest of the position previews that'll be going up: linebackers, defensive backs, and special teams. That's all we have left. And then we will have you guys officially prepared for this season. And then we'll be covering all of fall camp for you guys, giving you any storylines that are coming out around the Tar Heels. Hopefully we get a little bit more around this group than we did in the spring, a few more updates that we can bring to you guys on both the website and the podcast side of things. When it comes to the podcast, best place to watch us is over there on YouTube. Make sure you go over to that YouTube channel, give us a subscription. We would greatly appreciate that. We're trying to get to 1,000 before the season starts. The only way we can do that is with the help of you guys. So make sure you head over there, give us a subscription. And if you could, when you watch the podcast, make sure you head over there and watch it. It's a great experience. It'll also, when you're done with the podcast, whenever we're done live, it'll probably suggest to you to go back and watch our previous videos where we break down all the other position groups. So that's the best way to watch it. Do appreciate those watching on Twitter and Facebook as well. At Heel Tough Blog on Twitter, at Heel Tough Blog on Facebook to follow us on social media. Both those direct streams to just our content. After that, I think that's pretty much it. Basketball stuff, we'll have you guys covered on the website and on the Four Corners side of things with any other news that comes out this offseason, and plenty of other offseason fun for you guys on that side of things. So make sure that you're keeping up with us over there and on the YouTube page. But that's going to wrap it up for this edition of the podcast. Want to thank Josh for hosting with me. Want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.